It was a very beautiful, fine day. Yes. Wow, blue sky. And I could see 2 American bombers, B-29 bombers, flying very high in the air. I just thought, oh, beautiful planes shining in the morning sun, silver white, like ice candies.
And I felt like I had been thrown into a smelting furnace, and that a rain of fire was coming down around me.
I was just crawling around the floor. And when I touched my head, my whole body was bleeding from head to feet.
Everybody was simply black from head to toe, and you couldn't tell if they were male or female. And amongst the people who were escaping, you could see their bones sticking out, their skin and muscles simply hanging from their bodies, as they stumbled forward, escaping from the city. We came upon a bamboo grove, and there I saw this child, maybe 4 years old, who was simply black from head to toe, with his eyeballs hanging out. And finally, in that area, was where I was first able to lie down.
What does it mean to each of us that we now can destroy our own species? It's a subject that seems to repel the human mind and the human heart. And it's only on rare occasions that we permit ourselves somehow to look at it and glimpse it.
It's a very unstable situation. I think it's outrageous that it still exists. It's senseless.
The United States is a nation protected by 2 oceans from conventional invasion. The atomic bomb made the United States vulnerable for the first time in modern history. Nuclear weapons are about the only thing that makes us insecure, and they are the real threat out there.
We live in an age that's nuclear. Just what that means to some is unclear. I'm Ion Fleming, your atomic sage, and I'll be your guide to this nuclear age.
I think it's time for a different kind of guide for this nuclear age. I'm Bud Ryan, and I've had a special interest in nuclear weapons since I first went to Japan in 1991. Nuclear weapons have pretty much disappeared from public consciousness since the end of the Cold War. But from what I've learned over the years, and especially while making this film, I think we better start thinking about them again, and fast.
All the things that have happened, let's say the past 17 or 18 years in my life, seem to have lined up for me to become an anti-nuclear activist. I married a Japanese woman, Tomoko, and when I went with Tomoko the first time to Japan, we went to Hiroshima. That was the first time I had been there, and it was just had monumental impact on me.
It was the first time I had considered the atomic bombing of Japan from the point of view of the bombed, instead of from the point of view of the bomber.
And then we moved to New Mexico in July of '91. And then when we found this property, right behind my shoulder is Los Alamos.
Los Alamos is in the northern mountains of New Mexico. In 1943, the U.S. government brought some of the brightest scientific minds there to work on the Manhattan Project. 2 years later, those scientists drove their new invention, called Gadget, to a remote part of southern New Mexico to test it. On July 16, 1945, the United States catapulted the whole world into the nuclear age. Today, the test site is only open twice a year. I wanted to know why people would come from all over the world to take each other's pictures here as if they're at Niagara Falls when this place is still radioactive.
What do you think about this place and what happened here?
Well, to me, it's just very humbling. I mean, because of the fact that we had to do something like this to preserve our peace and to ensure peace for our country and for a lot of countries of the world.
So what do you think about what started here on July 16th, 1945?
Aren't we all glad it happened? I am.
So you think it won us the war?
Absolutely, I certainly do. I'm one of the many people that believe we saved many, many lives, both American and Japanese, by dropping the bomb.
Mm-hmm. And Truman made the right decision.
I believe so.
We're both Americans. We pretty much get the same education here and stuff like that. So where do you base that on?
Knowledge of the subject.
I actually used to think that the bomb ended the war too, but then I came across an exhaustively researched book by author Gar Alperovitz.
I mean, Japan was essentially defeated by early 1945. They were making airplanes out of bamboo and crushing acorns to get fuel for the airplanes. Food was in great scarcity. We were bombing their cities regularly, one right after the other, with very little opposition.
The first pictures from inside Japan's devastated capital, Tokyo, three-quarters wiped out by the superfortress attacks long before the atomic bomb. A city which once held 6.5 million and was to have been the capital of all Asia, now lies in ashes. Scenes like these leave no doubt that Japan was thoroughly beaten before the atomic bomb.
We broke the codes and we saw they were trying to find some way through the Russians to negotiate their way out of the war. We knew this as well early in mid-1945 and then on through July, well before the bomb.
And it seemed the only point that the Japanese were really concerned with was keeping the emperor.
That's the central point in all the discussions, that they wanted some assurances for the emperor, that without that, there's several ways to think about this. Without the assurances, we knew they would never surrender. He was a godlike figure. So long as we did not give assurances, we knew they would fight on. The question about the emperor was never whether he was going to be kept. U.S. military wanted to keep him all along for other reasons. The question was when we would tell them that. And we did not tell them that until after the bombs were essentially dropped.
I knew very well we'd never get the Japanese to calm down until the emperor told them to do it. And I wanted to be sure that he was in a position to do that when the time came for Japan to surrender.
So if the American government kept Japan in the dark about the plan to keep the emperor, I wonder if our government also kept the Manhattan Project scientists in the dark about its plan for the bomb.
Working on it had to do with the notion that Germany would make an atomic bomb and that we would lose the war. That was the source of the excitement and the dedication. Nobody who worked on it had in mind that Japan was the principal target. At the time the decision was made to use it against the Japanese, the scientists actually signed a petition, most of them, not to do that, to demonstrate, possibly a demonstration on some remote spot of the atomic bomb.
But their petition and their idea for a demonstration was ignored.
After we felt the explosion hit the airplane, that is the concussion waves, we knew that the bomb had exploded, everything was a success, so we turned around to take a look at it. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
This is
One of the observers on the plane that accompanied the Enola Gay on its mission to Hiroshima was Harold Agnew. He would go on to direct Los Alamos National Lab in the 1970s. And he was in the minority of scientists who supported dropping the bomb on the Japanese without a demonstration.
What were your feelings when you were looking out that window when you dropped the bomb?
All I wrote down in my notebook was that it worked, it really worked. My main concern was making sure our experiment worked and we got the data, and subsequently we were able to calculate the yield.
What's that first number that Truman mentions, though, about how many lives that the bomb saved?
Well, he's all over the map on the numbers.
We could advance on Japan and fight every inch of the way, losing 1 million of our own men, or drop the atomic bomb. We had expected to spend at least 150,000 youngsters in order to win the Japanese surrender. But they would have killed 3 million more people on both sides.
The number that was given credibility was created by essentially a propaganda article written to defend the atomic bomb by Secretary of War Stimson much later. And it's the 1 million figure, which was essentially a made-up figure. I interviewed the person who wrote that article, who was an assistant to Stimson, and basically it was a number that he got, I think, out of the air to create a big propaganda number. No one believed 1 million lives were saved. That's a number that I think is impossible to defend.
We talked with Ivan Ulrich at the Federation of American Scientists about the decision to drop the bomb. The FAS was originally founded by the group of Manhattan Project scientists who were opposed to the dropping of the bomb on Japan.
Part of the motivation for bombing a Japanese city was to impress the Russians for after the war. It's certainly clear that some of the decisions that we made in the development of nuclear weapons during World War II were designed to outlast that war and were getting ready for nuclear weapons to be used against the Soviet Union.
We all learned in school that we had to drop the bomb to save lives, but now it seems that there may have been other motives. We might have been trying to impress the Soviets, we may have been conducting a big experiment, and maybe another reason was just plain old revenge for Pearl Harbor.
All right, let's take a few minutes right now and get acquainted with an A-bomb. Basically and primarily, the atomic bomb is a giant sledgehammer. A weapon with a punch powerful enough to smash cities. The shock wave of a nuclear explosion wrecks the works of nature as well as of man. It's a triple threader. It blasts, it burns, it wields its own unique wallop, nuclear radiation.
While the bomber may regard his invention as a marvel of science, I was learning that the people who were bombed have an entirely different perspective. The museum in Hiroshima had such a profound influence on me that for nearly 20 years, I've been trying to figure out how to share what's inside this building with as many people as possible. The chairman of the foundation that runs the museum feels the same way, so he's agreed to give us an on-camera tour.
Well, this was the exhibit that got me when I first came here in 1991. Could you explain what we're seeing here?
These are the steps to a bank that was, I think, probably 300 meters or so from the hypocenter. And there was a woman sitting on the steps. And of course, nobody knows exactly what happened to her, but we do know that there was a woman sitting there waiting for the bank to open. And then she just evaporated.
To think of somebody being a living, breathing person 1 second and then the next second completely gone.
Yeah.
That's nuclear weapons. So the main part of the museum, and we have this horrific exhibit right off the bat. What is this showing?
Well, in a way, this is the piece that we want to show the most. Right after the bombing, this is what Hiroshima was like, except that there were hot flames chasing you. And some people say that this is too much like a horror house. And then other people say, no, this is nowhere near bad enough. You see their faces? Their faces are still pretty recognizable as human faces. The faces of the actual survivors were not. You couldn't tell if they were male or female. And anyone who was within 1 kilometer and was exposed directly, those burns were not skin, just skin. They were through all layers of skin and into the meat. So nobody survived at that level. This whole section here on radiation is really why nuclear weapons are illegal from the point of view of time. It is not limited in time.
So it's the bomb that keeps on killing.
Right.
The museums in Japan presented me with a perspective I hadn't really considered before, and that started me wondering about how the museums in the United States might be telling the story of nuclear weapons. So we set out to get some on-camera tours of some of the biggest U.S. museums devoted to the topic. This museum in Albuquerque is sanctioned by the Smithsonian to present our nuclear history.
So here you have pictures of, I'm assuming, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mostly this is Hiroshima.
I noticed that there's really no pictures of burned victims or skulls. Who made that decision not to show those kind of photographs in this kind of exhibit?
Because this is a public museum and a family museum, we don't have them on display for the general public, not burned bodies. However, if you'd like to see them, they are available and can be seen on video in the presentations we have in the theater.
Okay.
Now this collection does indicate and show the destruction of Hiroshima and indicates as well that it was rebuilt. It's one tiny part of our storyline to showcase the history of the nuclear story.
I wanted to know what some peace and justice activists in New Mexico would think about the museum. So I talked to Bob Anderson and Gene Pauls. Bob was in the Air Force, and now he and Gene run an organization called Stop the War Machine.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm a teacher. I've been teaching 26 years, and 24 of those years were in elementary school. As soon as I walk into the museum, I see all the things that I used to do to catch the attention of the first graders in my classroom. I see bright colors, I see vivid pictures. I see pamphlets with children with baby teeth, and I can tell right away who that museum is geared toward, and it's geared toward children.
Public opinion in the world is turning against nuclear weapons, anybody, even ourselves, having them. So this museum, I think, is designed to entice children, young people, into it without any critical thinking, any views of the consequences of the use of these horrible devices, which are genocidal in their effect.
We also got permission to shoot at the Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas. It had bright colors and some child-friendly exhibits, like the museum in Albuquerque. It made nuclear weapons seem necessary and a big part of our peace and prosperity. There was even a place where you could pretend to get up close and personal with an atomic bomb blast. If I had hair, you'd see it waving in the blast wind right now. Our guide was Troy Wade, who used to be the director of the entire Nevada test site. We began the tour with this museum's version of what happened during World War II.
Here's Adolf Hitler. This is the beginning of World War II, and Hitler was thought to be working on fission energy. And that caused Einstein to write his famous letter to President Roosevelt, in which he said, Mr. Roosevelt, I think we ought to do this as a country, and that was the beginning of the Manhattan Project of Los Alamos. Japan joined the war. Here's Trinity, the first test of an atomic bomb in New Mexico, I think 63 years ago. And then here you see pictures of Fat Man being loaded on the Enola Gay, and the 2 drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, but look who...
That's about all the attention this museum gives to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I think we need to take a closer look at a place Troy Wade mentioned, Los Alamos, the place where this all began.
This is the mile-high city of Los Alamos, the atomic city. This is a modern pueblo created by the people of the United States as a research and development center for atomic weapons. During the tense days of World War II, an entire American city of men, women, and children was hidden behind a seemingly unimportant postal number, Box 1663. Today, such secrecy is no longer possible. Today, the city boldly and proudly parades the normal pattern of American living. This now appears to be an average city of schools and playgrounds, of houses and apartments, a place to live where men and women can feel at home. But for all of these things, this city is not an ordinary city.
The Manhattan Project grew to become Los Alamos National Lab, known by its acronym LANL. The lab still has the mission of manufacturing and maintaining the U.S. stockpile of nuclear weapons. There's a museum there devoted to nuclear weapons history, but they refuse to let us come in and film. We even asked one of our New Mexico senators to write a letter to them on our behalf, but they still wouldn't let us in. So it makes me wonder, what are these people hiding? To try to answer that question, we took a trip to Los Alamos with Dave Stevenson, who grew up there, and Joni Ahrens, who runs the watchdog group Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety. They both keep a close eye on activities at the lab. We start our tour of the town at the lab's original plutonium manufacturing facility.
This is part of Technical Area 21. This is where they did plutonium manufacturing, and now those operations are coming back here. We're very concerned that any work down here to take down these buildings has to be done as responsibly as possible, because people live a block away here. Of all of the Department of Energy sites, this site has more people living right on its boundary than any other site in the country.
So, and this is one of the most polluted places on the planet behind us.
Yeah.
So you're saying the stuff they used to do here, they now do at other places up here in Los Alamos. Do you think they've learned any of the lessons that mistakes they made here?
Oh, I wish they did. They haven't done enough to be able to monitor, to tell us that they're actually doing things better. There's not the adequate number of groundwater monitoring wells, there's not enough stormwater monitoring, there's not enough air monitoring, there's not enough collection of soil samples for us to really know whether they've learned the lessons or not. It's important to know that the Rio Grande flows beneath Los Alamos, and Los Alamos is located on the Pajarito Plateau about 1,000 feet above the Rio Grande. So on the mesa tops, there's waste that's buried, and then in the canyon bottoms. So there's 18 million cubic feet of waste buried at LANL that has been generated since 1943.
18 million cubic feet of waste is enough to fill around 4,500 tractor trailers, and that's just the waste from one site in the nuclear weapons complex.
All of that waste is buried in unlined pits, trenches, and shafts, or else it's been disposed of by high-tech technology such as the kick and roll technology where they would put the barrels on the edge of the canyon walls and kick them over the edge. That was a technology. They've also discharged an enormous amount of radioactive and toxic and hazardous liquid waste into the canyons, and they discharge treated water now, but in the early days of the Manhattan projects until 1963, they were discharging untreated radioactive waste into the canyons. So all of that buried waste and the liquid waste is migrating to the Rio Grande. There's detections of plutonium and other radionuclides in Elephant Butte Lake, which is 200 miles south of Los Alamos.
Joni takes us on a hike through a city park that's a couple of blocks from the Los Alamos High School. It's called Acid Canyon, and we're about to find out why.
So in the early days of the Manhattan Project, they needed to do something with their liquid waste. The main facilities were around Ashley Pond. And what they did in those buildings was to dissolve plutonium in acid to extract it. And so there was a liquid waste that was created. They discharged that radioactive liquid waste into this canyon system.
This whole canyon has elevated levels of radioactivity, despite the fact that the lab has vacuumed it 4 times to get rid of the radiation. But we're going to a low point in the canyon where some of that old waste has been concentrated. Joni's group alerted the lab about the contamination there months ago, and supposedly they took some action. She wants to see whether they really took care of it. So, while the rest of us wait on top, she dons protective gear and goes down to get samples and take readings.
.373, 400, 411. Okay, 411.
That reading is about 13 times higher than the level of background radiation for this part of the country. Background radiation exists all over the world. It comes from natural sources, as well as the fallout from man-made nuclear weapons testing.
Do you feel comfortable taking your mask off yet, or you want to leave it on?
I think it's okay now. The blatant disregard, they know that that's there because they've been working with our scientists on it, and they've scraped it, but it's still there.
So you've taken readings there before. Are they similar to what you got today?
Yeah.
And, you know, we were figuring out, is that like 13 times higher than background?
Yeah. In a public place. And they haven't done the proper remediation. And they know it's there. So if they can't even take care of something that's isolated, that's in a public place, what are they doing with the stuff on their land? Quote unquote, their land.
Yeah, well, it's our land. Aren't we the government? We the people?
Yeah, we the people. Just such flagrant disregard, though, for human health and the environment.
The people who worked in the various nuclear weapons facilities around the world have a lot of well-documented negative health effects. The lab at Los Alamos is no exception. The park in the middle of Los Alamos was once the center of activity for the Manhattan Project. So I visited there with Dave Stevenson to ask about his father, who'd worked at LANL for many years.
So Dave, could you tell us about, what went on with your dad when the government started giving compensation for workers who got cancer because of the jobs they were doing in places like Los Alamos or Oak Ridge?
My dad first contracted cancer in, I think it was 1976. And during those days, he also told me how much he was opposed to nuclear weapons and how much he was really ready to get rid of them, even though he had been part of the process of building our arsenal that we have today. He passed away in 1986. Years later, in 2007, they found that there was a better than 50% chance that his exposure here at the laboratories was the cause of his cancer.
Dave's dad was one of almost 53,000 workers recognized by the federal government as having gotten sick or died from hazardous exposures they received doing nuclear weapons work. But the government has denied the claims of 127,000 other nuclear weapons workers as of late 2009. Workers who mine uranium, the very first step in the nuclear cycle, have also suffered from exposure to radiation. To find out more, I talked to Dr. McCallie from Physicians for Social Responsibility, which has been researching the effects of radiation since 1961. What are some of the health effects that people who mine uranium would be?
Short of working in a lead suit, if you're going to mine uranium, you're going to be at risk. They are being irradiated as uranium is an emitter. Not everybody who was a uranium miner has cancer, but they have cancer at rates that far exceed the general population. There is not any way to make that a safe activity.
There are big deposits of uranium ore in New Mexico, so I rode out to Laguna Pueblo to visit Carletta Garcia. She grew up looking down on the world's biggest open-pit uranium mine, and she lost both her mother and her husband to cancer caused by exposure to the radioactive uranium.
My mother hauled high-grade uranium ore to the crusher and was exposed big time to the radiation. At lunch, they would eat and they would sit on top of the ore piles and have lunch. At that time, they really didn't issue any type of, equipment, but a little paper mask to put over their face and a flashlight and a hard hat and safety glasses were what were mandatory at the mine.
So how about any mining officials? Did they ever come to visit the mine to see what was going on down here?
I don't know. I never saw any mining officials myself, but I'm sure they were there. But the only type of safety meetings we had were like with OSHA, and it was how to properly, use machines and nothing about radiation or...
So you shouldn't be sitting eating your lunch on a pile of uranium.
Nobody ever said that to us, no. But, we are, putting our generations in grave danger. We don't know what the next generation's going to have to suffer as a result of radiation. There's a lot of animals around this area that have tumors. I remember one year we were going rabbit hunting for rabbits to eat, and when we took them, we found out they had a lot of tumors inside their stomach tract and the intestinal area, so we just had to bury them. And there's a lot of people that have cattle and sheep around here, and there's been instances where the sheep have become, bald. They've lost all their wool because of radiation poisoning. That's one of the first things is your hair, that goes when you're radiated.
There's even more opportunity for radiation exposure at the end of the nuclear cycle, after the bomb explodes. Nations with nuclear weapons have exploded more than 2,400 of them, all in the name of testing and national security. The radioactive fallout from all that testing has boosted the level of background radiation around the entire globe, but the effects have been most keenly felt by people who lived on or near the testing areas. One hard-hit population lives on the Bikini Atoll, where the U.S. blew up 22 weapons over a 12-year period. Anthropologist and author Barbara Rose Johnston has researched the effects of these blasts on the island people.
I worked with the people of Rongelap. Rongelap is an atoll that is downwind from where we tested at Bikini and in Inuitak. Downwind meaning some 83 miles from where we tested our largest nuclear weapon, Bravo test, in March 1st, 1954. And the people on Rongelap were not evacuated, as they had been for previous tests. The people were left for 3 days in fallout, like snow coming down, before they were evacuated. The first couple of years, almost half the women had either unable to carry a baby to term, or the children that were born were not recognizable as children. Over the years, that became a problem throughout the Marshall Islands. And The kinds of things that women were giving birth to, there were no Marshallese words to describe. They had to make up terms like jellyfish baby or grapes or things like that to describe the kinds of things they're giving birth to. Despite the fact that we knew that there were not only concerns and problems with radiation from fallout, and not only that people were getting sick and ill, and we were documenting that, but we continued letting people live in a contaminated setting because those people didn't count very much, because those people were Marshallese. They were a different color of skin. They were in the middle of the Pacific. They, in some of the quotes that I found in the classified informal discussion between scientists who were doing this work, some of those quotes talk about, well, these people were they're more like us than mice. And in the context of the times that this work was being done, the Marshallese were considered less human.
The Marshall Islanders weren't the only ones present during those bomb tests. There were U.S. military personnel there as well, and many of them were treated as less than human.
Within 1 to 7 minutes after the Baker blast, radioactive water was deposited on all but 9 of the target ships, producing dosages that would have been lethal to all exposed personnel. A month later, men were getting along swimmingly in the bombed lagoon.
We were assigned to what was called the salvage unit. 4 hours after each bomb detonation, we were back in the lagoon, alongside target vessels, putting out fires so that crews could come aboard later and assess the damage. So I'm on the bridge of the ship. I heard the captain of my ship to the flagship on voice radio. He told them, you know, here's the status of the job. All my men have had maximum safe exposure. You know what the reply was? Safe exposure my ass, don't let that ship sink. This is one of the reasons I say we weren't men. We were part of the equipment. And I'll spell it out for you. I had a daughter who had problems with her endocrine system all through her teenage years, had half of her pancreas removed at the age of 20, and a number of years later developed a brain tumor. It had metastasized, and she developed cancer sites in other parts of her body, and ultimately died at the age of 46 of cancer. Nuclear testing is a high-risk business measured anyway, and it certainly was in the early days of atmospheric testing. People knew radiation was going away from the test wherever the wind carried it, and that people were going to be exposed. I don't think there was any, I don't believe there was ever any deliberate decision to expose people.
There are approximately 200,000 U.S. atomic veterans and untold numbers of downwinders around the world, many in states east of the Nevada test site.
Survival town Atom Test measured a model village in the Nevada desert against the awesome power of nuclear energy. Buildings of various materials went up. $1 million worth of equipment was installed, including lifelike mannequins, and tons of food to measure the contamination caused by radiation. Nearly 6,000 persons participated, including troops sheltered by trenches. Many cameras in many locations filmed the single blast.
Shockwaves roll over the men huddled in the trenches. Never before have we had such a close-up view.
If you ever hurry to a shelter, don't let your brain run you helter-skelter. Think, then do, yeah, that's the best way for you and your friends to come out okay.
Growing up in Marin County, California, and recognizing the fallout shelters, and knowing that the closest fallout shelter to my home was 7 miles away. And I knew at age 7 that everybody wasn't going to fit into the basement of the courthouse if there was a nuclear war. And knowing that the adults were lying to us.
Know what to do and what you will need. Then you will be able to take the lead. Yeah, why don't you be the expert in your shelter in time of alert?
This was in the 1950s in this country. And I already, probably at age 9 or 10, started to ask my parents, how could a desk protect from a nuclear attack? And they thought it was ludicrous also.
In the early years of the Cold War, the Atomic Energy Commission, which would later become the Department of Energy, spent a lot of effort and taxpayer money trying to convince a leery public that not only could you survive a nuclear attack, but that nuclear science was nothing short of a miracle and radiation was A-OK.
I declare, with all these atomic plants going up everywhere, I wonder if a girl's even safe in her own home. I just hope they know what they're doing.
You and I are living in the atomic age. The peaceful atom, no longer just a laboratory dream, is here today, working wonders, providing a happier, more abundant world for all mankind.
And already, through the healing power of the atom, we can all look forward to happier, healthier lives for ourselves and our families.
How we've gone down the medical road in large part occurred in our positive uses in the medical technology, whether it be imagery or treatment, came out of a massive government investment in how can we come up with peaceful purposes of using these isotopes. Massive investment. Had that money been placed into other kinds of technologies and approaches, we would have a different dimension and approach to dealing with these diseases. And in fact, now we're understanding that, maybe using radiation for imagery is not as important as using other kinds of resonance imagery, for example, magnetic resonance imagery. There's positive things that you can say, but that positive thing comes out of a track that was a heavily subsidized track that we could have gone a different way with our understanding of health treatment.
That is, there's no threshold. There isn't a certain amount of low-level radiation that's safe. Okay, and there's now increasing concern about the levels of radiation that are used in diagnostic techniques. New CAT scans, spiral CAT scans, and variations on those kinds of X-rays. The doses are fairly substantial.
I wondered if kids today are getting any better information about nuclear weapons than I got growing up in the 60s and 70s. I found some people at the Trinity test site who I thought would be good to ask about this.
Okay, so tell us about this nuclear science merit badge.
B&W Pantex is currently the sponsor of this.
B&W Pantex in Amarillo, Texas, used to help build nuclear weapons. Now the people there dismantle them. Pantex is also a storehouse for 10,000 plutonium pits, which are the heart of a nuclear weapon.
And we teach it in Amarillo. It's a 3-Saturday class and a 2-day trek here to Trinity site in Atomic Museum in Albuquerque and up to Los Alamos labs.
What actually do the scouts learn through this?
Well, they learn about a lot of the vocabulary of what is an atom, what do we think about the atom, who developed this model of this atom, and a lot about the scientists that the evolution of of where we are today with the scientific models that we are using.
We also go over the good uses of it, the nuclear power plants, the medicines that we've been able to use it with, the irradiated foods, the different things that this was able to achieve for us as a country and as a world.
So I was a Boy Scout too, and I learned a lot in the Scouts. But it seems what these Scouts are learning is part of the propaganda that our country has learned since the end of World War II. So the question is, have these weapons done us any good? Have they kept us safe?
We tried to talk to a variety of people who we thought would want to answer those questions. We asked the director of Los Alamos National Lab twice for an interview, and he ignored our requests. So we tried to talk to our elected representatives from New Mexico about nukes. We asked our 2 U.S. Senators, Jeff Bingaman and Tom Udall, and 2 of our U.S. House members, Ben Ray Lujan and Martin Heinrich, for interviews. They all either declined or ignored us. We also tried to talk to several people in the department that is in charge of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. But everyone we wrote to declined to talk to us, although they did say good luck with our project. So while we were in Washington, D.C., we went to the DOE headquarters to try and get a shot of me standing out in front of the building, saying we had attempted to talk with the people inside. But 4 men in military fatigues accosted us, took down all our personal info, erased our footage, and briefly detained us in front of the building. All this despite the fact that there were no signs forbidding videotaping or taking photographs. Well, we can learn something about how safe nukes have kept us by taking a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a close call that turned out to be a lot closer than most people thought at the time.
The United States answer was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war.
In his book, JFK and the Unspeakable, author and longtime anti-nuclear activist Jim Douglas explores what was going on behind the scenes during the standoff between President Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev.
With virtually all of his advisors, with the prominent exception of his brother Robert Kennedy, pushing him toward invading Cuba and attacking the Soviet missile sites, which would have involved beginning of a nuclear war, since unknown to his advisors, they'd already been armed with the nuclear warheads. As Kennedy resisted all of that and began to be overcome with the pressures, and he appealed to Nikita Khrushchev. He reached out to him and he said, "I need your help. I can't get out of this." And Khrushchev said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him," said to his foreign minister, and he couldn't even believe what he was saying himself. And then he said, "We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war." And at that moment, everything turned upside down.
I went to find out more about this chapter of the Cold War and nuclear weapons in general from author Jonathan Schell, who's known for coining the term nuclear winter in his best-selling book, The Fate of the Earth.
Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis was by far the most dovish person in that room of the executive committee. And at one point he took Pierre Salinger aside and he said, "Say, do you think those people in there know that if we make a mistake, 200 million people can die in the next half an hour?"
In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was living here in Queens, 13 miles from Manhattan.
If the Cuban Missile Crisis had gone differently, New York probably would have been one of the first cities to go down, you know, and we wouldn't be here right now. I could have been a cinder chip.
Missile crisis changed President Kennedy. He started working behind the scenes with Khrushchev to abolish nuclear weapons, and in 1963, he went public with his intentions.
First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. To make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
But the American University address is to John F. Kennedy's assassination as Martin Luther King's April 4, 1967 Riverside Church address is to his. It shows the reason, the motivation behind those assassinations, which is to stop, in the case of King's example, a resistance to the Vietnam War, and to stop, in the case of Kennedy's example, a resistance to the nuclear arms race in the Cold War.
The nuclear buildup continued into Ronald Reagan's presidency. George Shultz, then Reagan's Secretary of State, was well aware of the world's growing nuclear arsenal and all of its dangers.
During the Cold War, people were paying a lot more attention. And the effort to keep track of things was intense. Even so, there were close calls on a nuclear exchange.
More close calls? How close are we talking? I went to find out more about this from the director of the Titan Missile Museum in Arizona. She used to serve in the Air Force here in this underground bunker, ready to launch the missile if duty called.
The whole war plan for the United States is based on the fact that it takes 30 minutes for a missile to fly between the United States and the former Soviet Union and vice versa. But submarine-launched ballistic missiles can cut that 30 minutes down to 10 or 12 minutes. Then the only way that you're going to be able to launch your missiles if the Soviets launch from their sub first is if you get the keys out and if everybody is ready to launch.
So it's kind of like Russian roulette on a certain level.
On a certain level, yes.
Yeah. There was never an alert, though, while you were working here, was there? That, like, be ready to launch, that something could be happening?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. There were several times in the 80s where things got a little excited, kind of out of the blue.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when President Reagan was shot, they elevated the readiness of all the missile sites and all the strategic bombers.
It's just an awesomely irresponsible setup. I mean, to reduce the amount of time for the commander to brief the president to 30 seconds to a sound bite. I mean, that'd be a pretty good sound bite with the fate of the Earth hanging in the balance. But apparently they have the same timelines in Russia, because both sides moved to this launch on warning posture, which put us in that position.
The mission of the Titan II is peace through deterrence, to demonstrate that even if the Soviet Union attacked us first, that we would be able to retaliate with such force that we would wipe the Soviet Union off the Earth just as they were wiping the United States off the Earth, okay? So that there's nothing to be gained by either side launching against the other side. And that whole theory is mutual assured destruction, also known as MAD, which I think sums it up very well.
Yes, a very appropriate acronym.
For me, as a young Air Force officer, I believe that. And that's how I did my job.
So how old were you when you were down here?
And I was in my early 20s. The whole time I was on crew. I was a crew commander right before I turned 24.
People think that after the Cold War ended, mutually assured destruction became a thing of the past. But it turns out the policy, MAD is still alive and well.
Right now, as we're talking, the United States and Russia are prepared within a half hour or so to launch a total of more than 2,000 nuclear warheads at each other.
Yes, we and the Russians have nuclear weapons that are on alert status. It's a very unstable situation. I think it's outrageous that it still exists. It's senseless.
Well, of course, those arrangements were put in place during the Cold War. Even then, they were frankly crazy. It's almost as if we were waiting for the quarrel to come along to justify on both sides having these arsenals that we failed to get rid of after the Cold War ended.
It might seem we could never get rid of nuclear weapons, but the world has actually had 3 big opportunities to do so. The first one was in 1946. It was called the Acheson-Lilienthal Report. It would have put all nuclear material under control of an international body, and the material would only be released in small amounts for peaceful uses, such as nuclear power generation. But President Truman basically sabotaged the plan, whether intentionally or not, we'll never know for sure, by giving it to a Wall Street financier named Bernard Baruch. Baruch made changes to the plan so that the U.S. kept their nuclear weapons until negotiations about international control, inspections, and research was finished. The Soviets said the U.S. had to get rid of the weapons before these things could even be talked about. Neither side would budge, so the Cold War was officially underway. Soon after that, a reporter friend of Truman's said to him, "You know, you've just condemned the world to a nuclear arms race." To which Truman replied, "I know, but we'll always stay in the lead." President Kennedy presented us with our second opportunity to be rid of the nuclear menace.
In the spring of 1963, John Kennedy signed a national security memorandum which committed him and the United States government to seeking 2 things. One was a test ban agreement, and the second was the process of complete disarmament. Now that sounds totally idealistic and visionary. He was serious at that point at going way beyond what any of us were talking about in that day. Kennedy, as a result of that, was assassinated, and Nikita Khrushchev lost power within a year after Kennedy's assassination.
Our third chance came in 1986, when President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev met in Reykjavik. The 2 leaders seemed to be sincere in their desire to move toward total disarmament. But unfortunately for us, they fell short of an agreement.
Mr. President! Do you have an agreement, Mr. President? Do we have an agreement, sir? Will you meet again? Have you agreed on anything?
I remember when we came home from Reykjavik, Margaret Thatcher practically summoned me to the British ambassador's residence, and she gave me a beating for how could you sit there and allow the president to agree to abolish nuclear weapons? I said, but Margaret, he's the president. She said, yes, but you're supposed to be the one with his feet on the ground. But Margaret, I agreed with him. Oh, my God. But that was the general opinion in Washington. This was a nutty idea. We were all disappointed because we had on the table basically agreements. And we had this final step of eliminating nuclear weapons and having a staged reductions of ballistic missiles. And it all couldn't come together because we couldn't agree to the Soviet demand that we abandon what amounted to the effort to provide a strategic defense.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, was a system that was supposed to shoot down incoming nuclear weapons before they could reach their targets.
Defense Initiative, also called SDI or Star Wars by some, is a massive undertaking in any terms and especially ambitious in its computer-related requirements.
It's very, very difficult and probably impossible to develop what we would consider to be reliable software. And there are a number of reasons for that. The software would be enormously complex. It would be the most complex software package ever written, for one thing. And second of all, it can't be tested under realistic conditions. In order to test it, you'd have to have a nuclear war.
And by the way, after 27 years and many billions spent, Star Wars has never worked and undoubtedly never will. But now it seems we might have one more chance to get rid of nuclear weapons, and it could well be our last.
We are here today because enough people ignored the voices who told them that the world could not change. Today, the Cold War has disappeared, but thousands of those weapons have not. In a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Now we too must ignore the voices who tell us that the world cannot change. We have to insist, yes, we can. Together, we will strengthen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a basis for cooperation.
Imagine we're on the side of a mountain. At the top of the mountain is a world free of nuclear weapons. The air is nice and clear up there. We can't even see it from here. At the bottom of the mountain is a world where more and more countries have nuclear weapons. We're going down the mountain right now. We better get turned around and start going up the mountain. And here are the steps that we need to take that will gradually get us up the mountain. And maybe after we get up a while, we'll get to a base camp where we can see the top. And then we'll have to figure out how to make that final assault.
Well, that's one approach, but I have a different approach. I think it should be like D-Day. You know, Eisenhower and Churchill and Roosevelt faced plenty of obstacles when they launched D-Day. They didn't say, well, let's go to the beaches and see how that goes and decide whether to climb the cliffs, and then let's decide how that goes and decide whether to liberate France, or then maybe move on into Germany. They said, no, we're going to launch this invasion, we're going to get the job done, we're going to face the obstacles, and we're going to overcome them. I would begin by announcing that it is the serious and determined policy of the United States to join with the other 9 nuclear powers on Earth to get rid of their weapons, their nuclear weapons, bring it down to 0, while at the same time putting in global verification and enforcement measures.
There is also support from people who many thought hawkish during the Cold War. The most famous examples are George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, who along with Sam Nunn and William Perry have published a call for nuclear abolition twice in the Wall Street Journal.
As I said, the reaction to Reykjavik was very hostile. The reaction to this op-ed was to kind of bring people up short and say, you know, this nuclear issue has kind of fallen off the table, and we better pay attention because there is proliferation going on.
They traditionally have just laughed at the idea and considered it just to be some kind of utopian nonsense. So their endorsement of it removes what has traditionally been one of the great obstacles to the idea. The irony of the situation is that we don't have the public movement. Back in the early 80s, we had the public movement and not the establishment, and now it's sort of the other way around, so it's a little bit puzzling.
And without that public movement, the Obama administration is battling tremendous political pressures. In the hopes of getting an arms reduction treaty ratified, President Obama tried to placate opponents by raising the budget for nuclear weapons to its highest spending level since the Reagan era. The Obama administration has a formidable opponent, a giant tangled web of corporate contractors and the government, all with vested interests in nuclear weapons. President Eisenhower tried to warn us about it when he left office in 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
So how much has our country spent on nuclear weapons? Conservative estimates reach higher than $7 trillion.
And money. Do you have any idea how much all this testing here at the Nevada test site has cost through the years?
Well, no, I do not. I know that it's a number that's in the trillions. The test site was there were 928 tests conducted at the Nevada test site over a 50-year period, and it cost a lot of money.
There's been a lot of taxpayer money pumped into various sites all around the United States, not just the Nevada test site and Los Alamos. There are the national laboratories, which have nuclear research components, nuclear weapons storage sites, nuclear weapons factories, and nuclear power plants. Just in 2010, new federal loan guarantees for building nuclear power plants increased by billions of dollars.
Well, some people also would say that nuclear power plants have never actually made a dime, that they're the most subsidized corporation ever in the history of the United States.
Perhaps so, but so is the oil industry. I mean, think about the tax incentives given to Exxon and the big oil companies, too.
But they've shown a profit over time, and where nuclear power, to the best of my knowledge, has never shown a profit anywhere in the United States.
Perhaps not. They are regulated industries, however. You know, these are not like Exxon Mobil or places like that. These are utilities. And so, you know, in some cases they don't make a profit.
But it won't make free electricity. No atomic plant ever will. Shipping ports' complex nuclear apparatus and tons of concrete and steel add up to a multi-million-dollar investment, jointly shared by government and business.
New nuclear power plants are only built with huge government subsidies of the insurance, of tax rebates, of direct subsidies.
There are probably going to be more nuclear power plants built. And a nuclear power plant uses enriched uranium. And if you can enrich uranium for a power plant, you can enrich it for a weapon.
And that's the whole issue in Iran, for example, is that the Iranians claim bomb? What bomb? We're just building these centrifuges to enrich uranium for a nuclear power plant. But exactly the same centrifuges, not similar technology, not the same approach, precisely those pieces of equipment could be used to then further enrich that uranium to make uranium for a nuclear bomb.
The only thing that could make it a little bit safer would be the abolition of nuclear weapons. You'd have to preferably go back to the Acheson-Lilienthal plan and put all nuclear technology under the same international control. Mind you, I'm not addressing now the whole question of whether nuclear power in itself, with its problems of Chernobyl-like explosions, the horrible and unsolved problem of where to put the waste so it can sit for 1 million years without contaminating anybody. I'm not even mentioning those issues. I'm really just talking about the connection with proliferation, and that's a deadly connection.
As we all know, people are fallible. If there's more fissile material out in the world, thanks to nuclear power plants and other sources, it seems just a matter of time before something really bad happens. A terrorist could build a bomb, or there could be another accident like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island. It turns out there have been some pretty bad nuclear weapons accidents already.
So tell us what this exhibit is here.
This is the actual casings of the Palomares incident. And so that was a nuclear weapon accident, a broken arrow, if you would. And there were 32 of those broken arrows over the years. This is some material that was recovered over the coast of Spain. Refueling plane closed too quickly on the B-52 and there was a crash. These are B-28 thermonuclear H-bombs. All 4 fell out. These 2, their parachutes deployed, and the other 2, their parachute failed, and they hit the ground and their high explosive detonated. And so even though no weapon has ever gone critical, if it wasn't intended to, it made a terrible mess because there's obviously plutonium inside these things, and it blew that all over the ground, and it had to be cleaned up. So it was an environmental nightmare for the United States to clean that up.
I think the people of Spain would probably consider it an environmental nightmare too. Some of the other 32 accidents included a time in Wyoming when a computer malfunction caused a missile to go into launch mode. The people working there parked an armored car on top of the missile silo to stop it. Then, in 2005, at the Pantex plant in Amarillo, Texas, there was a time some exhausted workers put too much pressure on a missile they were dismantling and almost blew up a hydrogen bomb that was 100 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. There was even a broken arrow in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1957 when a bomber accidentally dropped its load just outside the city limits.
There was actually one in Albuquerque, too.
And that was a pretty big bomb, the one that fell in Albuquerque.
One. Yes, it was the biggest that the United States ever built.
Bombs aren't the only part of the nuclear cycle that present opportunities for accidents. Storage and disposal of radioactive waste are problematic, too. A fire near Los Alamos laboratory came close to causing a nuclear catastrophe in the year 2000. Joni Ahrens, who runs Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, remembers it well.
So this was a fire that started as a prescribed burn by the Forest Service. Mm-hmm. We were monitoring the fire, but when the fire got near Area G, that's when the scientists were like, what is going on? Mm-hmm. Because there's 40,000 drums of transuranic waste sitting above ground in fabric tents. So the fire came within a half mile of the entrance to Area G, or, the big technical area. And the fire came right up to the plutonium facility.
If that fire had gotten to the barrels and they had exploded and this stuff gets into the air, how fast would you need to get out of there to be not affected, you and your family?
We're not going anywhere. We're going to be quarantined. Nobody's going anywhere. They'll shut down the airports, they'll shut down the roads, and people will be held here. That's the plan, because we'll all be contaminated. They know that they can't allow people to leave the area. So how big the quarantine area would be I don't know how big it would be.
So basically, you're talking about maybe even Albuquerque, if
Mm-hmm.
the wind was blowing south, would have basically been like Chernobyl.
Yeah.
What if one of these big bombs went off? What would that even look like?
This area here is talking about the fire. And the fire was a very significant part of what happened. And this whole area right here was totally burned. It was crushed and burned. Almost anything combustible in this area burned. And I just want to point out that this area here is 2 kilometers, and this was created by a fireball that was 280 meters. If a 20 megaton bomb had been dropped, the fireball itself would have been this big as this whole thing. That's just the fireball.
Translating that to an American city, if a 20 megaton bomb was exploded over Lower Manhattan, this is what the destruction would look like. The fireball would stretch from Brooklyn to New Jersey, and the firestorm would be at least 16 miles across, scorching everything in the most populated parts of New York and New Jersey.
And then the firestorm would have been, 20 or 30 miles out would have been the firestorm. And it would not take all that many of those kind of firestorms to change our climate. That's what we've been hearing lately.
The first sound is this. And that's the sound of one BB dropping into the tin. And for the purpose of our sound experiment, this one BB dropping into the tin represents all the firepower of the Second World War, also including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this sound, for the purpose of our experiment, represents roughly 3 megatons of firepower. But this second sound is the sound of all the nuclear weapons in the world over 60 years since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then I asked them to close their eyes so that they can really focus on the sound. So it's easy for us to go right to our heads, and think, wow, that's a lot of weapons, or I wonder how many that is, or would we blow up the world? Well, yes, it is a lot of weapons, and yes, we could blow up the world more than once, but the first time is the only time that counts.
It is a kind of vision which is apocalyptic that many people have become numb to. So I think it's very important to remember to go back again and again to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hiroshima, seen from the air after the atomic bomb blast that virtually erased this city of 340,000 people from the earth. Nagasaki, target for the second atomic bomb. Just 3 days after Hiroshima, this explosion was concentrated in an area of 1 square mile, destroying its selected terrain even more completely.
Can I read you this quote by Admiral Leahy? I don't know what your opinion is of him.
I don't know him, but hurry up.
Admiral Leahy was the head of...
Yeah, I know who he was.
All right, he said, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children."
Well, that's his opinion.
Okay, so you don't
That's his
coincide.
baloney,
Okay.
from my opinion.
All right,
You
well...
know, I don't see what the difference is if you burn them up with fire or you burn them up with nuclear explosion.
And even to this day, when I see the sunset and red sky, it reminds me of that day and those terrible things. And I simply do not like sunsets.
Early on August 9th, 1945, the air raid siren sounded. So I went with my 8-year-old sister and my elder sister's baby on my back to hide in a cave, which turned out to be 800 meters from the hypocenter. At 11:02 a.m., there was a huge flash. I remember the flash, but the blast wave threw me against a rock and knocked me out. I regained consciousness because someone was knocking on my head, and I was shocked. In the cave, where I thought there was nobody else, There was a person with their eyes hanging off by their nose, a person who was burned black. There were painful groaning sounds, so I looked and saw people with their stomachs torn open and their guts spilling out. There was a person who was swollen, a person begging for help with a headless baby on their back. There were many people like that in the cave. The cave was full of corpses, and the stench led to the three of us children all joining everyone else in vomiting, the smell of which made us even more ill. The next morning, at last, we were helped by a voice from the outside. When we stepped outside, I was shocked. There wasn't a single house left. We saw charred corpses lying about everywhere. We were barefoot, and our feet were unbearably hot, but we headed for the bridge, weaving in between the corpses, crying out, "Mommy, Mommy." When I looked down from the bridge onto Urakami River, I saw lots of people, some with burned bodies, who looked for water, drank the water, died, and sank to the bottom of the river. Corpses lodged on rocks, and corpses who were drifting towards the sea. We got to the place where we thought our home was, but the whole area was devastated and there was nothing there. We desperately searched for our mother. "Mommy, Mommy!" We screamed for our mother from the bottom of our hearts. No matter how loudly we screamed, only our voices echoed in the devastation. And we didn't hear any reply. My mother was dead, charred, beside the body of a lady from our neighborhood. So we tried our best to live on, but we couldn't live like humans, and we couldn't die like humans. The reason was, we had a mysterious disease. Our hair fell out, our gums bled, and blood appeared in our stools. Everyone was disgusted by us. We struggled on like this. Then, where my sister had been scratching her stomach, pus accumulated. Then maggots appeared. No matter how many you removed, they continued to appear. At night you could hear their squidging sounds. She would cry, "Ni-chan, can you take off the maggots that are eating my flesh?" But there was no light. We didn't have a lamp. And it was pitch black, so I couldn't remove them. I told her just wait until dawn. So she suffered all night. One day, my sister didn't come home. I was wondering where she was, and I heard someone say, "Hey, this time a young girl jumped in front of a train." I ran over and saw, right in the middle of the tracks, her face, which had been smashed up, with her arms cut off and her legs missing. Train wheels take all the clothes with them. That's how I found my sister, dead, naked, showing only the maggot-infested part of her body. I held my sister. A city official brought me a box. I lowered my sister into it, and my chest was totally red with her blood. People gathered around, and I heard them say things like, "Look at that body. Where did the arms go? No legs," coming from all around. I staggered along the railway tracks saying, "Why did you die? Why didn't you try harder?" Picked up her arm, and her other arm, her leg, and her other leg, scraped off flesh which was stuck to the rails using a stick, and put them in the box. Today, after 62 years, I suffer from a mysterious illness. On the uterus, crucial for a woman, I had a tumor, so I had to have my uterus removed. The atomic bomb did not stop with us. In the generation after Hibakusha, the second generation, there are many people who suffer from mysterious illnesses, such as where their thyroid glands, their throats, swell up and their hands tremble, and many people, young people, who developed leukemia and died in agony.
How many years after that was when you first went to Japan?
I think the first visit was in '64.
And did you get to see any Hibakusha when you went there? Survivors?
That is.
Hibakusha are survivors of Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
No. I went about 2 years ago. I did go back and was interviewed on a Japanese TV program. And I was confronted, if that's the right word, with a couple of survivors who had been 10 or 12 years old, who had absolutely no background or understanding of what had started the war or what Japan had done. All they knew is that they had been bombed, and what they wanted was an apology, and I essentially told them, remember Pearl Harbor, and walked out.
The reason I wanted to stop here and talk to you about this is because this is my confession time. That when I first came through here in 1984, I was really just thinking like a bomber. And my interest was in the power of the bomb. And my first impression was somewhat being disappointed that there were still so many buildings still standing. I was thinking, it was a tougher bomb than that. All of those things should be flat. But it wasn't for at least, I would say about 2 years. I suddenly was reading a book called The Children of the A-Bomb. In reading that for the first time, I actually shed tears because I couldn't help but actually think about that, think how it was to be in that situation. And then I realized how I had not been letting myself do that, and became very much aware that there's a huge difference between people like you who come through and feel what you feel, and people like me and people like a lot of the businessmen that I bring through here who come through and we are not open. We are thinking like bombers. We are not into seeing the suffering. We only see the power.
When you say love thy neighbor as thyself, that means do unto him as you would have him do unto you, the golden rule. And the golden rule and then the statement of Jesus Christ on love thy neighbor as thyself is the fundamental basis of the Christian religion, the Jewish Talmudic religion, and also the religious teaching of Buddha and Confucius.
The Church's position has always been consistent that any use of nuclear weapons would have no moral justification whatsoever. It would be an abomination and a sin against humankind.
Well, the United Methodist Church believes that nuclear weapons should be abolished. We're unequivocal in our stance on that, have been for many years, and believe that nuclear war is morally indefensible. And it's a very straightforward, clear stance, I'm happy to say.
Well, I think that they're fundamentally immoral, that there is no possible justification for having them, that there is no way that they could possibly be consistent with anything in our religious traditions, in anything in our spiritual traditions, or in anything in our common sense.
Well, there's no question from the point of view of Buddhism that what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a profound and egregious ethical and moral violation. From the point of view of Buddhism, the first precept very clearly says, do not harm, do not kill. And the mass killing that happened in Japan, which many, proponents of nuclear weapons will say prevented the war from continuing, was at a level of violence that is really difficult for most of us to put our arms around.
So all the core teachings of Jesus are this visionary nonviolence. And if you want to be a Christian, you have to get on this road to peace and pursue this vision of nonviolence, which means also standing up and saying no to war, poverty, executions, global warming, and no to nuclear weapons. And we have to abolish them to reclaim our souls, reclaim spiritual life, actually I think reclaim our humanity. And then we will begin to discover who we are, the beloved sons and daughters of the God of peace.
At the beginning of August, people come to Ashley Pond in Los Alamos to commemorate what happened at Hiroshima. While in Hiroshima, the people there commemorate the dead by floating lanterns on the river near Ground Zero. There's another tradition that takes place at the Hiroshima commemoration in Los Alamos, in which some of us put on sackcloth to show our repentance for the sin of nuclear weapons. This action is inspired by a Bible story from the book of Jonah, where everyone in the city of Nineveh donned sackcloth to show their repentance for their sins.
When I come here every year, I recall the abolitionists from our own American history who walked into the country publicly and said, we are announcing the abolition of slavery. A new world is coming where everyone will be equal. And the people said, you're crazy. It's in the Bible. We've always had slavery. No, they said. They held up a vision of a new world without slavery. And they gave their lives for that vision. We are like new abolitionists. We're coming to Los Alamos, like our brothers and sisters in Hiroshima. We are announcing a new world without nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons have been with us since 1945, and to a lot of us, they may seem overwhelming. But there are already lobbyists, scientists, activists, elected officials, Habakashah, and many others who are working on this issue. We just need to join or support them.